For more than 160 million years, life on Earth moved slowly enough for memory to matter, as continents drifted apart almost invisibly. Oceans rose and fell across generations, and forests expanded and returned in rhythms that rewarded patience rather than speed. Change existed, but it arrived gradually, giving ecosystems time to adjust and species time to adapt. Which is why extinction, when it happened, usually unfolded over thousands of years instead of moments. The dinosaurs did not inherit a fragile planet, but evolved within a system that had already survived volcanic winters, drowned coastlines, advancing ice and earlier mass die-offs, adapting not to chaos but to repetition. They were not reckless rulers of their world, but experienced inhabitants shaped by deep time, whose bodies and behaviors matched landscapes that valued consistency, memory, and endurance. Across the northern continents, vast floodplains filled and emptied with seasonal regularity, rivers wandered slowly enough to be remembered, and forests grew where sunlight reliably returned year after year. Migration routes did not need to be discovered, because they had already been proven across countless seasons, worn into the land itself by generations that followed the same paths and returned to the same breeding grounds. Predators hunted within understood limits, relying on timing and terrain as much as strength, while prey survived through distance and awareness rather than panic. Along the coastlines, inland seas breathed in and out with ancient tides, reefs built themselves grain by grain, and shallow waters fed nurseries that replenished the oceans year after year. Storms came with warning, seasons shifted in order, and nothing in the natural world happened all at once, allowing life to respond instead of simply endure. Dinosaurs filled every viable ecological niche because the planet allowed specialization to succeed, supporting creatures that lived fast and light, others that lived slow and immense, some that traveled vast distances, and others that remained bound to a single region. All of them relied on the same unspoken assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough for experience to remain useful. Even danger followed rules that could be learned, as injuries healed or killed but rarely confused. Environmental signals made sense, and familiar responses continued to work. When the ground shook, it did so locally. When the sky darkened, it did so temporarily. And when the sea withdrew, it always returned. Generations lived and died without witnessing anything that rewrote the basic logic of the world. Eggs hatched into landscapes their parents recognized, and parents died believing those landscapes would remain. The dinosaurs did not think in eras or endings, but in seasons, rainfall, distance between feeding grounds, and the predictable movement of light across the sky. Sunrise arrived from expected directions, shadows moved predictably, plants responded without hesitation, and energy flowed upward through food chains without interruption. Even extinction respected time. As species faded gradually, ranges shrank slowly, and adaptation remained possible because the pace of change allowed it. The dinosaurs had never experienced a moment when time itself became hostile. On this day, the world still believed in its own continuity. As the sun rose without distortion, the air carried no unfamiliar scent. The wind followed old patterns, and inland seas lay calm. Herds gathered without urgency, predators waited without desperation, and nothing suggested the rules governing survival were about to fail. If the planet could have been paused at that moment, nothing would have seemed fragile, not the forests, not the oceans, not the animals, and not the sky. The systems that governed life still held, and because they had always held before, nothing alive had learned how to imagine otherwise. Nothing yet understood that history had already moved ahead of it. Nothing knew that memory was about to fail, and nothing knew that the sky itself was about to stop behaving like sky. So life continued forward, confident and unafraid, because for 160 million years, the world had earned that trust. And because nothing on Earth knew it was already out of time, the sky begins to misbehave. The first changes did not arrive as danger, but as inconsistency, subtle enough to be noticed without being understood. Light behaved almost normally, yet not quite, as brightness lingered longer than expected and shadows stretched farther than clouds could explain. Colors sharpened in ways the eye could register but not interpret, making familiar landscapes feel slightly unfamiliar without becoming threatening. Animals reacted not with panic, but with hesitation, lifting their heads more often, pausing longer before moving, and abandoning actions that usually came without thought. Migration routes that had guided herds for generations suddenly produced indecision, as groups slowed, stopped, and reoriented without committing to a new direction. Bird-like dinosaurs took to the air more frequently, not fleeing anything visible, but circling as if searching for cues that no longer aligned. Predators delayed hunts they would normally attempt, not sensing prey weakness but sensing uncertainty in the environment itself. The wind shifted in ways that did not match weather patterns, arriving without storms and changing direction without warning. Air pressure fluctuated subtly, not enough to injure, but enough to be felt by bodies tuned to stability. The ground began carrying a vibration too low to hear and too broad to locate, passing through soil and stone rather than through air. Trees shuddered faintly without wind, loose stones trembled, and water surfaces rippled even when the air remained still. Animals felt the movement through their feet and bones before their senses could assign meaning to it. This was not an earthquake, because it did not originate beneath the land. It felt like pressure arriving from elsewhere. Across wide regions, the sky took on a quality that defied categorization, neither darkening nor brightening fully, but tightening, as if depth itself were changing. Clouds held their shapes longer than they should have, then broke apart without wind to explain it. Sunrise and sunset remained on schedule, but the light between them felt strained, sharper at times, flatter at others. Plants continued to grow, but leaves turned slightly differently toward the sun, responding to angles that no longer felt exact. The environment was still functional, but its signals no longer agreed with one another. Animals relied on pattern recognition more than reasoning, and now patterns began contradicting themselves. Some species moved earlier than usual, others later, and some did not move at all, waiting for confirmation that never came. Herds bunched more tightly than before, not from fear, but from the instinct to reduce uncertainty through proximity. Solitary animals abandoned isolation and lingered near others without clear purpose. The world had not become violent, it had become confusing. Nothing yet suggested catastrophe, because catastrophe usually announced itself loudly, and this did not. There were no storms, no fire, no visible threat advancing across the land. Instead, the planet behaved as if responding to something life could not see, hear, or name. The dinosaurs did not interpret this as warning. They interpreted it as noise. An anomaly that would resolve itself, as anomalies always had. The sky had misbehaved before, and then returned to order. So life continued, slower now, more cautious, but still confident that explanation would follow. No instinct existed for a threat that moved faster than comprehension. No memory prepared them for a cause that had not yet revealed itself. And so the world waited, functioning imperfectly, unsettled but intact, as the planet continued responding to forces still beyond perception. Because whatever was coming had not yet arrived, and the sky had not yet explained why it no longer behaved like sky. The oceans pull away. The first place that change became impossible to ignore was not the sky, but the water. Along coastlines that had followed the same tidal rhythms for ages, the sea began to retreat farther than memory allowed. At first it looked like an extended low tide, a temporary exaggeration of a familiar cycle that would soon reverse. But the water kept pulling back. Shorelines widened into exposed flats, and reefs that had always lived beneath shallow waves suddenly lay open to the air. Marine life thrashed in shrinking pools where the ocean should have been, while fish followed channels that no longer connected to deeper water. Predators moved toward the retreating sea, misreading the moment as opportunity rather than warning. The withdrawal did not arrive with waves or sound, but with silence, as if the ocean were holding itself away from the land. Inland seas began to behave strangely as well, sloshing against their boundaries without storms to drive them. Water levels shifted unevenly, rising in some basins while draining from others, defying the balance that had always governed them. Currents slowed, then reversed, then stalled entirely in places where movement had never failed before. The ground beneath coastal regions began to carry pressure and pulses, not sharp enough to crack stone, but strong enough to be felt across great distances. Cliffs fractured along old fault lines, not collapsing yet, but weakening in preparation. Riverbanks softened and failed in small sections, sending sediment into waters that suddenly could not carry it away. Animals near the coast grew restless, pacing unfamiliar ground where the sea had once acted as boundary and guide. Nesting sites were abandoned as familiar landmarks vanished beneath exposed sand and stone. The smell of the shoreline changed, carrying minerals and decay that had never mixed with open air before. Farther inland, the vibration beneath the ground strengthened, still inaudible, but no longer ignoble. It passed through bedrock rather than soil, arriving everywhere at once without a clear source. Trees trembled without wind, and water rippled in still basins, as if something massive had shifted far beyond sight. Animals reacted by moving upslope, not fleeing anything visible, but obeying instincts older than conscious reasoning. Herds changed elevation instead of direction, climbing ground they rarely used, leaving behind lowlands that suddenly felt unsafe. Predators followed, abandoning familiar hunting territories without knowing why. The oceans had begun responding before the land fully understood what was happening. Water, less rigid than stone and less patient than life, adjusted first. It gathered energy quietly, redistributing mass across basins and shelves in ways no living creature could observe directly. To those watching the coast, it felt like absence rather than action. The sea was not attacking, it was rearranging itself. Still, for many creatures, the moment did not feel catastrophic. The world was strange, but not yet hostile. The ocean had withdrawn before, after storms or earthquakes, and it had always returned. Experience suggested patience. Memory suggested correction. Nothing in living history suggested the sea could leave and not come back. So animals lingered along the newly exposed shorelines, confused but unafraid. Some followed the water farther out, trusting familiarity over instinct. Others waited inland, expecting reversal. The oceans, however, were no longer behaving as oceans had been taught to behave. They were responding to forces moving faster than tides and deeper than currents. And the message they carried was already spreading across the planet. Because when the water begins to leave first, it is not retreating, it is making room. The second sun, the change that followed, did not begin with sound, but with light. Across wide regions of the planet, brightness intensified without warning, not rising from the horizon or breaking through clouds, but appearing all at once, as if the sky itself had been switched on. For a brief moment, the world seemed overexposed, colors bleaching toward white, edges sharpening, and depth collapsing into flatness. Shadows fractured, splitting and stretching in directions the sun could not possibly occupy, pointing away from nothing that could be seen. Animals froze mid-motion, not from fear, but from sensory overload, as instincts failed to match what their eyes were reporting. Eyes burned, not with flame, but with intensity. The light carried heat, but not the kind produced by fire. It arrived as pressure, compressing the air faster than bodies were built to adapt. Breathing became labor as lungs worked against suddenly heavier atmosphere. The heat wave swept across continents in seconds, outrunning sound and overtaking weather itself. Forests reacted before life could. Leaves flashed into combustion without burning, igniting from shock rather than flame. Sap boiled inside trunks, splitting bark and releasing steam that carried the scent of resin and ash. Entire canopies collapsed into drifting gray clouds that rose and spread before falling back toward the ground. Far from the source, ash began to fall without explanation, coating feathers, scales, leaves, and water surfaces in fine, stinging layers. Visibility dropped as daylight dimmed behind suspended debris, turning midday into a heavy, copper-colored dusk. Sound arrived late, not as a single explosion, but as a rolling thunder that folded over itself, echoing across plains, valleys, and oceans at once. The ground shuddered beneath the pressure, transmitting shock through stone rather than soil. Cliffs failed where fractures had already formed, collapsing in sections rather than catastrophes. Rivers surged against their banks, then withdrew unevenly, as if uncertain which direction gravity now favored. Animals ran, but not away from anything they could see. They moved because standing still felt wrong. Herds compressed tightly, not scattering in panic, but clustering as if proximity might restore order. Predators abandoned hunts mid-pursuit, instincts overridden by the environment's sudden hostility. Parents fled nesting sites, leaving eggs exposed to falling ash and heat that lingered in the air. The sky did not darken fully, it thickened. Debris suspended high above filtered sunlight into an unfamiliar spectrum that confused vision and distorted distance. Temperature dropped rapidly after the heat passed, swinging from oppressive warmth to sudden chill within hours. Plants stopped responding to light that no longer behaved as expected. Photosynthesis slowed, then stalled, as leaves turned but gained nothing from the sun. The world had crossed a threshold, not into destruction, but into malfunction. The systems that governed energy, light, and air no longer agreed with one another. Cause and effect slipped out of alignment. For the first time, The dinosaurs faced a problem that experience could not solve. They had survived storms, droughts, floods, and fire. They had never survived physics, behaving differently. Still, the event itself had not yet arrived. What covered the land was aftermath, not origin. The sky had changed faster than life could understand, and whatever had caused it was still on its way. Aftermath without an event. What followed did not feel like an ending, because endings are usually loud and unmistakable. This felt like the world forgetting how to work. Ash continued to fall long after the light faded, settling into forests, wetlands, and shallow seas, coating everything in a fine layer that burned the throat and stung the eyes. Breathing became difficult, not because the air was gone, but because it carried substances life had never learned to filter. The sun still rose, but its light arrived weak and filtered, dimmed by debris suspended high above the atmosphere. Daylight took on a muted copper-gray tone that confused time, making mornings resemble evenings and evenings resemble storms that never broke. Temperatures dropped rapidly, not in seasonal steps, but in sudden shifts that bodies could not acclimate to. Warm-blooded creatures burned energy faster than food could replace it, while cold-blooded ones slowed into dangerous stillness. Plants stopped growing. Leaves turned, angled, and waited for light that no longer fed them. Photosynthesis stalled across continents, interrupting the foundation of every food chain at once. Herbivores searched familiar feeding grounds, only to find plants intact but empty, present but no longer nourishing. Predators followed weakened prey, but hunger spread faster than hunting could resolve. Water sources changed character as ash and sediment clouded rivers, ponds, and inland seas, altering taste and smell beyond recognition. Some animals refused to drink, others drank and sickened. Migration failed completely, as landmarks vanished beneath ash and roots no longer led to usable resources. Herds moved in widening arcs, covering more ground than ever before and finding less with each passing day. Parents abandoned offspring not from cruelty, but because energy could no longer be divided. Eggs lay untouched, cooling beneath skies that no longer warmed the land. Firestorms ignited hours later in places far removed from the original disturbance, sparked by falling debris reheating the atmosphere as it returned from above. Winds accelerated beyond anything forests had evolved to withstand, flattening weakened trees and spreading ash into new regions. Oceans, still unsettled, began assembling waves far offshore, stacking energy quietly beyond sight. Currents twisted unpredictably, mixing warm and cold waters in ways marine life could not escape. Reefs collapsed under chemical stress rather than impact, bleaching and dissolving as water composition shifted. Still, for many living things, death did not arrive immediately. Suffering spread instead. The world remained recognizable, but unreliable. The rules that once governed survival no longer produced consistent results. Instincts contradicted outcomes. Movement wasted energy. Stillness invited cold. Every choice carried consequence without guidance. The dinosaurs did not understand this as extinction. They understood it as a series of bad days that refused to end. The sky remained heavy, never clearing enough to restore confidence, never darkening enough to force rest. Time stretched, measured not in seasons, but in interint. The catastrophe still did not announce itself. There was no single moment to point to and say this is when everything ended. The disaster was not an event. It was a condition, and life was now trapped inside it. Before the end arrives, life did not end all at once. It thinned. Days passed without improvement, then weeks, then stretches of time that no longer resembled seasons. The sky remained dim and unreliable, never fully dark, never fully clear, denying the world both rest and renewal. Cold settled in, unevenly arriving in waves that punished movement and stillness alike. Animals conserved energy instinctively, slowing migrations, shortening movements, and choosing shelter over distance. But shelter no longer protected against hunger. Plants remained standing but inactive, frozen in a state between life and death, unable to convert light into growth. Herbivores weakened first, their size turning from advantage to liability as stored energy drained away. Predators followed, not through battle, but through absence, as prey simply failed to arrive. Oceans continued reorganizing themselves beyond sight, assembling waves far offshore, redistributing heat and mass in silence. Currents no longer respected latitude or depth, carrying cold into warm regions and warmth into places that could not absorb it. Marine life struggled beneath altered chemistry, where oxygen dropped and acidity rose without warning. On land, familiar landmarks vanished beneath ash, snow, and debris, erasing roots written into instinct. Migration ceased to function as a strategy. Movement no longer led anywhere better. Some animals wandered until exhaustion ended them. Others stayed still and faded where they stood. Parents lingered beside offspring longer than instinct advised, delaying inevitable choices because nothing about the world felt certain anymore. The dinosaurs did not know they were living in the final hours of their age. They did not understand extinction as a concept. They only understood that memory no longer worked, that experience no longer predicted outcome, that the sky no longer explained itself. The planet felt unfinished, as if something massive was still in motion, still approaching. Pressure lingered in the ground. Tension remained in the air. The world behaved like a held breath. Somewhere beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond understanding, the cause of all this was still arriving. But for those living beneath the dim sky, arrival did not matter. Everything that sustained certainty was already gone. History had already moved past them. And so the Age of Dinosaurs did not end with a roar. It ended with confusion, with silence, with a living world waiting beneath a sky that had already decided.